Irungu Houghton and Chaloka Biani on human rights organizing in Africa during a global pandemic, trends and insights. Irungu is a friend of mine, ex-FAM, as we call ex-Oxfam people, and he's brilliant. He's currently in charge of Amnesty in Kenya, and he's got a book out on these issues, and that'll be really interesting. Probably not as interesting as tonight, though. So once I get the okay from Deepa to go, are we off and running, Deepa? Yep. Okay. Welcome, everybody. My name is Duncan Green. I'm a professor in practice at the Department for International Development, and I'm chairing tonight's discussion. The session is being recorded, including Q&A. You'll be able to ask questions in Zoom and on YouTube, but students who wish to ask anonymously can private message James Putzel if they want to. If you're a tweeter, please tweet using the hashtag #CuttingEdgeIssues. And that's as much of the digital housekeeping as I'm going to do. Now what I want to do is go on to the actual speakers and introduce them, because we have a cracking lineup for tonight. The main speaker is Tasneem Essop, who is currently the Executive Director of the Climate Action Network International. She's just completed serving her second term, so she must have been good, as Commissioner in the National Planning Commission in South Africa, appointed by the President, and she leads the work on climate change and just transition. She previously headed the climate team in World Wildlife Fund International and served as the head of delegation for the organization of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. She became a member of the Provincial Parliament in the Western Cape in 1994 and held the positions of Provincial Minister of Transport, Public Works and Property Management from 2001 to 2004, and Provincial Minister for the Environment, Planning and Economic Development from 2004 to 2008, when she resigned from politics. Well, I'm not sure if she resigned from politics. She resigned from political office, which is not the same thing. So Tasneem was an anti-apartheid activist from an early age in different capacities until the democratic elections in 1994. During this time, she was a student and youth activist, a teacher and a trade unionist. What a fantastic CV. So we've got somebody in front of us who has been in positions of power. She's been in positions of social organization. She's been right at the heart of the debates on climate change. And she's going to talk us through the results of Glasgow and the Glasgow COP in November. The discussant is an old mate of mine, Tim Gore. Tim is the head of the Low Carbon and Circular Economy Programme at the Institute for European Environmental Policy, IIEP. He's a regular commentator in international media and public speaker on the climate and inequality crises, and a member of the board of Climate Action Network Europe. And what I love about Tim is that he comes on my blog, he writes pieces, and I don't have to edit them because he's such a good writer. So I'm really happy to have Tasneem and Tim on the lecture. Tasneem's going to speak for 45 minutes or so. She has told us that wonderfully she is not going to use PowerPoint, which makes everyone's evening. And then Tim's going to be a discussant to kick off the discussion for 10 minutes, and then we're going to go to Q&A. So Tasneem, would you like to get started?
Thank you very much, Duncan, and greetings to everybody. Best wishes for 2022. I hope that some of you had a bit of a break so that we come into this very challenging year, well rested and fully energized. I really am wanting to express my deep gratitude to you for inviting me to participate in this cutting edge session. I've been told that this is a lecture. I would like Duncan to see this as an engagement, and a really important engagement, just understanding that what we're dealing with when dealing with a climate emergency is so complex. There are no easy answers. There's no blueprint. And so engagement, dialogue, debate is really important. So I will try to stick to the commitment that I might be even shorter than 45 minutes, but let's see how it goes. So greetings again to everybody. I have been tasked to speak about COP26, the outcomes of COP26 and what the implications are for the way forward, the next steps, what needs to be done based on, what we achieved or did not achieve at COP26. So I really do want to be clear that I'm sure you have seen many analysis produced already from different perspectives. At the end of COP26, I tweeted that, what we're going to witness now is, of course, the battle of narratives. And so you would have seen and read different perspectives of the outcomes, what happened at COP and the outcomes, etc. I therefore want to make it very clear that what I'm going to offer by way of perspective is going to be something of a view through a climate justice and social justice lens. So what you'll hear from me really would be, weighted towards understanding COP26 within that broader justice framing and what we needed from that COP and what we actually got out of that COP. And why am I choosing to look at this through a climate justice frame? Climate justice has been used by language that has now been used by even the mainstream, often, of course, probably not necessarily with similar understandings, but the climate justice frame and looking at the emergency within that frame and looking at what happens in these multilateral processes are important because it basically puts the climate crisis in its ethical and political context and not, as often is the case, not just viewed as an environmental issue. The climate justice frame also assists us in bringing in the intersectionality of climate justice and social justice. So addressing issues of inequality, the human rights issues, power, poverty, etc. So it really is an important frame to look at in a very real way those intersectionalities. And then, of course, it also helps us forefront the fact that climate change has differentiated, and that's really important, impacts and will serve to worsen existing crises, such as inequality, poverty, gender injustice, etc. So that the nexus between the climate crisis, development, etc., becomes, through the climate justice frame becomes really useful. It also recognizes, of course, that there is historical responsibility, something that rich nations would love to ignore. But if you're looking at it through a climate justice frame, that is an important recognition. And of course, this climate justice frame makes clear the different means to achieve justice. And so both in terms of, achieving climate justice and social justice. So would look at things like redistributive justice, procedural justice, transformative justice. So I just wanted to put into perspective why I'm choosing, like many others in the wider movements, to look at this multilateral process that is often seen as very technical, etc., through a climate justice lens, and therefore give you a sense of what I thought the COP26 did and did not deliver. So to look at COP26, what were the outcomes, what we achieved, it's important, I think, to again remind ourselves actually that that event took place in a very particular context. Firstly, it was the time frame for that COP was delayed by a year. So the last COP had taken place 2 years before that in Madrid. Lots of unfinished business. In fact, the Madrid COP wasn't a success at all on a number of issues. And so the pandemic hit, and then the COP was postponed by a year. So in that interceding period, the context, of course, just changed dramatically. And what we were living through in 2021 especially was, just experiencing these multiple and compounding crises. The COVID pandemic, of course, wreaking havoc across the world, and most sharply felt in poor developing countries. Through the period, we witnessed increasing inequality and poverty, with millions, in fact, moving back into poverty and unemployment. Now, this pandemic raging gets further, compounded. The crisis gets further compounded by the experience of more frequent extreme weather events across the world. Nobody remains untouched on any continent. Hurricanes in the Philippines, flooding in Uganda and Germany, heat waves in Northwestern America. But, it's being felt both in developed and developing countries across geographies. But again, just to be clear, it hits the vulnerable the hardest. Vaccine apartheid during this period, unbelievable display of lack of solidarity, especially by rich nations, to just save lives. And so, the disappointing outcome of a G7 that preceded the COP in that year just contributed. Also, in the G7, the richest nations meeting did not even come anywhere near making the kinds of commitments to fulfill their climate finance commitments that they've made. And so this just contributed to this overall atmosphere of distrust. There's the lack of trust between developed and developing countries. At the same time, we've also all witnessed shrinking democratic space, especially for our frontline defenders, and the rise of the right wing in many places, fake news wreaking, putting out disinformation and confusing people. And again, in many places, very sharpened culture wars that we have witnessed. In a sense, also, this general lack of moral political leadership is also then becoming clearer. And Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, of course, says in a very serious indictment, called this an A for science, but an F for ethics, as a reference to the lack of moral leadership in the world. At this time, many countries announced recovery programs, and many of these countries announced that they're going to use the opportunity to go green, basically. So to have recovery plans that would invest in a shift towards a more sustainable and green future, and also address climate at the same time. But in fact, that did not materialize. What the reality was that there was continued investment in fossil fuels and other polluting sectors. And as I said earlier, in this year, we witnessed the breaking of all kinds of climate records, the increase in emissions after a bit of a dip in the previous year, increasing temperatures and increasing extreme events. So while this is the context, I should also mention that everything does sound very despairing, which it is, but at the same time, what we also witnessed in this period is the kind of, after a bit of a lull, just given the pandemic, the resurgence and rebuilding of the climate movement in 2021, with a number of key events, mobilizations, and in a very innovative way, especially the youth, continue to build that momentum and action. So, in this context, it's not as if everything just, is all despairing. There is this positive momentum through movements themselves, continuing to keep the push and the pressure. So that is the context in which this COP26, hosted by the UK government, happens in Glasgow. And we cannot ignore that, because that then sets up very serious expectations, this context of rising inequality, poverty, suffering, mostly experienced by those who are most vulnerable, the poor, the working class, women, etc., and especially in developing countries. So within that context, our expectations for this COP26 was much higher in terms of the need for it to deliver and respond to what we are all experiencing and living through. At the same time, during that year, ahead of the COP, the IPCC delivered its working group 2 report, and the science becomes even clearer. And here again, Guterres talks about code red for humanity. And so essentially that report just spells out the kind of physical impacts of climate change and also what the impacts will be for humanity. And so what we've experienced already, extreme heat, heavy rainfall, drought, fire, the ocean acidification, etc., all of that we're living through and witnessing. So these are not long-term impacts that we are, used to think about. They're happening now. They happened in 2021, and the COP happens in that context. So in this way, COP26 was really set up to be that moment of political reckoning to address the climate emergency. That it was this time when we should hold polluters to account so that they do meet the needs of the most vulnerable in this crisis. And that this COP26 needed to therefore deliver very strong basis to achieve climate justice. And while we understand that 2021 was an unprecedented year for climate impacts, as I said, compounding the existing other crises, the IPCC warning us about worsening climate catastrophes. What we understand, therefore, as we go into the COP, and here I'm trying to build this understanding of how we as climate, as part of the climate movement, saw this COP. We really believed that this is the time, since we are in the era of climate impacts, that we would have to address very importantly loss and damage, adaptation, finance, the key issues that will then address the context and our experiences. But maybe some of you know, there was a lot of I suppose, exciting things happening ahead of the COP. The UK government, and I will be polite about this, did not really prepare very well for the COP. And we had raised a number of concerns about it as a network, the network that I lead, ahead of the COP, which they weren't listening to. Logistics, safety, the fact that the pandemic will mean that the COP itself might not be inclusive, etc. And so set against this backdrop of vaccine inequity, all of that comes under scrutiny. And certainly just that issue of the lack of trust between rich countries, whether they will in fact address the climate crisis, or will they use the same approach as they did with the pandemic, self-interest, look inward, and not really address the needs and express and display solidarity with those who are suffering in the world. So really real questions about what especially the rich nations were going to do at COP26 and whether they were committed to addressing the needs of the most vulnerable. So essentially, when we went into the COP as my network, but of course the wider climate movement, especially those fighting for climate justice, we certainly wanted this COP to deliver broadly on 2 areas. The one, of course, is to deliver on the levels of ambition needed to address the climate crisis. So to make sure that the kind of radical and drastic reduction in emissions takes place so that we can avoid catastrophic climate change. The second, of course, is to achieve what I'm arguing for, and that is climate justice. And the proxy or our way of understanding what that climate justice could look like within a COP context is, of course, as I said earlier, recognizing that these impacts have hit those who are least responsible for the climate crisis the hardest, that the issue of losses and damages due to climate change was going to have to be the big issue on the agenda of this COP. Now, I do want to use this opportunity to just talk a little bit about our general approaches to our participation as activists in these multilateral processes. We've been in these processes for many years. You know, the results are pretty much the same. It's incremental changes or little victories that we see over and over again. But we're in a different context, as I said. And here we're really talking about a massive crisis for humanity, impacting all of us across the board, but more so those who are vulnerable. And so we couldn't go into this COP with this kind of business as usual approach. We'll go in there, we'll lobby with the negotiators, we'll try and achieve text changes here and there. And so what we decided to do in partnership with a whole range of other civil society formations and, you know, even other partners who are not necessarily civil society, we decided that even though loss and damage was not formally on the agenda for negotiations as such, finance for loss and damage, we were going to make pretty sure that this is going to have to be an agenda item, even though it wasn't formally. And so we tested new tactics by doing this. You know, there are always many issues that we would all want to deal with, but we decided that we are going to focus on the issue of getting finance for loss and damage agreed to, and that we would make this the litmus test for the outcome of COP26. It met with a lot of resistance. You know, the UK government really saw loss and damage as this little piece under another mechanism that needed to be sorted out. They weren't willing to actually put finance for loss and damage on the agenda. And so we had heavy lifting to do, which we did. And what was really exciting is, you know, we set this objective through this tactic of being pretty focused and escalating things before the COP and at the COP, to the point that we really said this issue should not be ignored. And I'm really pleased to say it was really testing new tactics, right? To say this loss and damage issue, which is also an issue that people really don't firstly necessarily understand, you know, in the communities necessarily. It's always seen as a technical issue, but it's deeply political and very real for those who are already experiencing impacts. And the fact that we managed to get so much attention on this issue at COP, we, you know, it was on the insides, the media coverage on loss and damage was consistent and regular. The wider civil society movements who are not working on the inside, but on the outside in the marches, the Global Day of Action, etc. Loss and damage, and if you, I've got photos, but I'm sure many of you have seen the pictures, loss and damage did end up becoming one of the big issues that we put, as the peoples, put on that agenda of COP, that it could not be ignored, to the point. And yeah, I think, you know, we're going to have to learn the lessons of adopting new tactics and how we use power. We talk about building power, but we also need to use power to bring about shifts. The G77 plus China, which is of course the bloc of developing countries, often do not necessarily come out with united positions on all issues all the time, but on this issue, the G77 plus China put forward a proposal for text for the establishment of a finance facility for loss and damage, which was, in our view at that point, a huge victory. It was really great. And of course, that happened through the pressure of vulnerable countries, the least developing countries, the small island states, etc., with civil society creating the kind of cover and pressure for that to happen. And what happened, of course, is something I will tell you when I deal with the outcomes. But I wanted to talk about how, as civil society, we also needing to interrogate our our strategies, our tactics, and, you know, especially the fact that we need to be far more sophisticated in the way we use the power that we have and that we're building up as well. So when we got to what we want out of the COP, loss and damage finance was the key issue. Of course, as I said, we wanted to have clear levels of ambition, so to be in line with the 1.5 degrees, that there has to be delivery of the 100 billion finance commitment that was made a decade ago. And of course, we wanted this COP to be an important moment where we signal the end of the fossil fuel industry. And so those were the things that we actually, as a network, as activists, through a climate justice frame, we wanted out of this COP. Did we get it? Well, I can tell you, certainly not what we needed to ensure climate justice. On the levels of ambition, again, you know, there was a whole narrative about how all these announcements that were made outside of the formal multilateral process, and there were many, many announcements, some of them really good announcements, that took us very close to 1.5. The problem is that these were announcements. These are initiatives. There's no accountability mechanisms. There's no mechanisms to check the robustness of any of those announcements. But this was part of this kind of curation of the moment to, you know, because the UK government said, this is the last chance for 1.5. And the official commitments on the table in the multilateral process does not add up to 1.5. So all these other initiatives and their announcements, they sort of said, well, we're getting close to 1.5. Please don't despair. But the reality is, no, we're not. And really, that is the reality. So on mitigation, on the levels of ambition, the one thing that we probably will revisit, and I'll talk about the next steps, is the fact that they have agreed to come back at the end of 2022, and countries have been asked to look at the revise their 2030 commitments. One of the big things, not, of course, nothing that we would say is a huge victory, but you must recall that in the context of the UNFCCC, the issue of fossil fuels has never been an issue for that agenda. In this outcome, though, very weak language, but language nonetheless, the issue of fossil fuels gets put on the agenda. And so there is a clause that deals with now what is called the phase down of unabated coal power, and also the phase out of what they're calling inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. You know, we can debate what that means. I've never heard of anything as efficient fossil fuel subsidies, but at least what we get out of this COP in terms of the ambition is fossil fuel gets put on the agenda. So I will talk about how we need to take that forward next. On the issue of ensuring justice and solidarity and addressing the needs of poor and vulnerable countries and communities, nothing, quite honestly. 100 billion that they were supposed to deliver, not delivered. They issue an apology and a regret for missing the target and kick this down the line to the future, to I think 2023. So no finance delivery on a commitment made already, as I said, many years ago. We get a bit on adaptation. So there's a commitment to double adaptation finance by 2025 and to look at operationalizing what they call the global goal for adaptation. On loss and damage, nothing. In fact, rich nations, and we believe it's actually the US, made interventions to block the G77 plus China text from getting agreed to. So the text that called, very importantly, for this finance facility for loss and damage got dismissed, did not make it through to the text, was not agreed to. And in fact, in its place, they called for a dialogue about this. So, and how long that dialogue will take place, we don't know, but that's what was finally agreed to on one of the most pressing, most urgent issues that needed to be addressed at this COP. So that was a dismal failure. We called it a betrayal of vulnerable peoples across the world. So where do we go next? Now, we come out of 2021, I've spoken about the context, we've just entered 2022, we've been reading about the science telling us that this last 7 years were the hottest on record. There's projections that extreme weather events will intensify in 2022 and beyond. The pandemic continues to wreak havoc. Omicron is just, exploded across the world. The numbers are getting higher. Of course, the issue of vaccine rollout is still a problem in poor developing countries, so the vaccine inequity issue remains. And poverty and inequality, of course, is still worsening. Now, what was, and I know that Tim, I hope you don't mind me referring to your previous life in Oxfam. Oxfam has produced a really, really important reports on issues of carbon inequality, and I hope you can read those, and recently just put out a report again on inequality kills. And this, for me, I think the important issue that I often feel very, I suppose, I'm not optimistic about it, because it doesn't seem to have really hit us in the gut as much as it should, but the kind of obscene inequality that we are witnessing in the world. And this Oxfam report basically highlights that 10 of the richest men, and I note men, doubled their wealth during the pandemic. Now, while nearly 160 million more people are actually pushed back into poverty, 10 men double their wealth. And of this, why they talk about this inequality kills, 21,000 people die every day due to inequality. And they've said that is, can you bring that down to 1 every 4 seconds? And in this, Bezos, Musk, and the 8 others of this 10 men earn $1.2 billion a day. Now let's put that into perspective. 160 million people being pushed back into poverty, 1.2 billion a day earned by the top richest people in the world. At the same time, last year, the IMF put out a report that also tells us something quite horrific, that fossil fuel subsidies, this is subsidies to the fossil fuel industry that's driving the climate crisis, amount to $5.9 trillion, or $11 million per minute. Per minute, $11 million. So in that context, and of course, there's much more that we can talk about the context we're living through, what should we be doing next? Well, the first thing I want to say is that, I would want to suggest that we would need to intensify the work and the fights we are putting for ensuring climate and social justice. We just have to intensify the fight across the board, because what we're going to need to address this emergency, and I will say emergencies, because of the multiple crises we're experiencing, is of course a radical transformation of our economies and societies. And so the time for that and the window for that is closing very rapidly. We have to have emissions reduced by half if we want to stay below that kind of, not entirely safe, but below a 1.5 to avoid catastrophic climate change and all the consequences coming with that. So that's the one thing I think for all of us, especially those who are active or would like to become active, we need to intensify these fights wherever we find ourselves. The other thing that I think is really important for us to do as part of this radical transformation of our economies is to ensure, that the just transition away from fossil fuel-based economies is happening. If it hasn't happened yet, and there's no planning for it, and entire kind of whole of society approach hasn't been adopted yet, then we're in trouble. It should have happened, and we should be already far down the line in planning these just transitions already. There are some exciting potential opportunities for us to also take things that has come out of the COP26 agreement, or pact as they call it. The one is, of course, just pushing back, again, pushing on the work that we started at COP26, this whole escalation on the issue of addressing climate impacts, making sure that there's going to be finance for addressing the losses and damages, and that work starts now. It's not a COP issue, but that we start putting on that pressure already. We are going to, of course, have to deal with addressing climate impacts in a real way, because people are experiencing it, and they are, we need to address that. But also, we need to ensure that the multilateral process recognizes and establishes a finance facility. So again, continue our escalation on that issue. The fact, as I said earlier, this agreement does now talk about fossil fuels is a door that needs to be pushed in completely. That door needs to be opened up, and we have to put fossil fuels firmly on the agenda again. Not just at the COP, every day should be a day that we're pushing back on the fossil fuel industry. Every day should be a day. And at the COP itself, in the multilateral process, build off this very weak outcome and language on fossil fuels and push that to be far more ambitious in the next round. And then also use this opportunity where they've said governments must come back at the end of this year with enhanced national actions. So we need to do our work at the national levels to push our governments to, in fact, do that. Don't come with, stories about how we can't revise these things. We're doing the best we can. Every country can do better. So certainly to use this opportunity of them needing to come back in 2022. And so we have to make sure that we keep 1.5, it's really big debates about that, but we do try and keep as far as possible 1.5 alive. And we do that through an equitable and fair shares way, which means that finance needs to be delivered. Now, COP27 is going to be hosted in Egypt. It is already being recognized as an African COP. And so it would be really important, as a COP being hosted on one of the most vulnerable continents in the world, vulnerable to climate change and all the other crises, poverty, inequality, etc. It would be important for us to put a lot of pressure on this COP to be the COP that delivers for the vulnerable, not just in Africa, but the vulnerable peoples across the world. And the last thing I would like to also just add for all of us is to say that, we, in a very small way, we could see how using and asserting our power on one issue in this multilateral space did create some kind of movement on something that was not even on the agenda. So the issue of continuing to build power through people's movements and then using that power strategically and getting sharper at our tactics so that we can catalyze the kind of change that we require, not at an event only, but that we do this, of course, because we need radical transformation of our economies and societies. And then connecting our fights, we often, climate activists are, seem to be operating in a little climate bubble, but connecting these fights, and therefore a climate justice lens is important. The fights for social justice and climate justice become critical. And so thank you very much, Duncan. I'll leave it there. I'm not sure if I went over my allocated time, and certainly really looking forward to Tim's responses and then to the engagement we will have with everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tasneem. I think you've achieved a first, which is to actually speak less than the time you were supposed to speak for, which I think has never happened on this lecture series. Before, as Tim gets ready to give his remarks, just to remind people, please put your comments in the chat. What normally happens in these situations is everybody's shy at the beginning, and then everything comes in a rush at the end. If you get in early, you'll be called to ask your question. So please don't be shy. Get in there. I'm sure you got lots of questions. That was a lovely, clear, passionate presentation with a lot of insights. So I'm sure there's lots of questions. But over to you, Tim, for 10 minutes of discussion.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. And as Tasneem alluded to, we've been working together for a long time. I used to, before my current role, I was at Oxfam. I was the head of policy for climate change and food for, over a decade. So Taz and I had a lot of time at the UNFCCC process, wading through the difficult moments. And I just, thanks, Taz, I think we're also lucky to have you now in this position, in particular leading CAN. So thank you for everything that you are doing. I would just add two aspects I wanted to reflect on as well that Tasneem has touched on. One is about the keeping 1.5 alive and the emissions gap and what we do about it now, and bringing an equity perspective to that question. And I'll just reflect on a couple of the pieces of work that we've done around carbon inequality that Tasneem mentioned, and how that kind of work in civil society can perhaps help to make a difference. And what it means now in terms of the pressure that we need to bring to bear on certain countries and how we might go about that. And then the other aspect of the outcome at the COP I wanted to just reflect briefly on was the doubling of adaptation finance as well, is perhaps to give a slightly more positive outcome as well, that we can also take some pride in the role that we've all played in civil society with developing countries to achieve that. So on the 1.5 degrees, as Taz said, I mean, this is the big part of the narrative for the COP presidency and for all of us. That's the ultimate litmus test of whether or not this process, all of our efforts in the climate movement are adding up sufficiently to stay below that critical temperature threshold, which, remember, is there in the Paris Agreement because of the demands of climate vulnerable countries, in particular in Paris 5-6 years ago. And the fact remains, of course, that going into the COP, we're certainly not on track to keep warming below that level. And all of you that are familiar with the emissions gap framing that the UNEP, the UN Environment Programme, brings to this issue, they publish the reports every year which estimate where emissions need to be by 2030 and by 2050 if we're to stay on track to limiting warming below that level, and where we project them to be based on the emission reduction commitments that are on the table. And that gap is huge. I mean, we need to reduce emissions still by approximately half where they are today now, already by 2030. So that, the likelihood of doing that gets more and more challenging as each year of delay or inadequate action passes. And one thing that I wanted to bring to the discussion is how you might approach that question from a climate justice perspective. The importance then of saying, well, who's responsible for this gap and who has to do what in order to get us back on track? And much of the debate, I would say traditionally, and certainly at the UN level, in terms of the fairness of action to reduce emissions, is focused on what different countries have to do. It's a fight, ultimately, it's a UN negotiation, and it's a fight ultimately between rich and poor countries, of course, with a lot of complexity and a lot of nuance, but it's about the responsibility of different countries. Now, one additional lens that we have brought to that through work that I started when I was at Oxfam and continued now in my new role at IEP, but still working with Oxfam and with colleagues in the Stockholm Environment Institute, is to look at not the responsibility of different countries to reduce emissions, but the responsibility of individuals, all of us as individuals, and to look at the inequality of that responsibility according to different global income groups, wherever people happen to live in the world, the rich and the poor. And so we've been able to show in recent years that what we call extreme carbon inequality exists and is a core part of the climate problem, in that very approximately the richest 10% of people on the planet are more or less responsible for about half of global emissions every year. And very approximately the poorest 50% of people are responsible for about 10% of emissions. And what's more, the richest 1% alone are certainly responsible for more emissions than the poorest half of the global population. They might even be responsible for double the emissions of the poorest half of the population. So that's the general picture. What we brought to this with new analysis that we published during the COP was to say, what's that picture look like in 2030? How can we look at who is driving this emissions gap, which is pushing the 1.5 degree goal out of reach? And so we basically, project forward based on the emission reduction commitments that have been made by different governments. And what we showed is that based on the commitments that are on the table, the richest 1% of people around the world in 2030, they're still going to have per capita carbon footprints, which are 30 times higher than they need to be if we're to keep warming below or on track to keep it below the 1.5 degree goal. So this group alone are just essentially, way beyond what it can be a sustainable carbon footprint. The richest 10% are about 10 times higher. The middle classes are getting close to it. The global middle classes are actually getting closer, and they make the biggest relative reductions by 2030. And meanwhile, the poorest 50% of people on the planet, they are still going to be living well below that sustainable level. So this is the inequality that is driving the emissions gap. It isn't the emissions of the vast majority of people on the planet that is pushing the 1.5 degree target out of reach. It is overwhelmingly the emissions associated with the livelihoods and the consumption patterns of a minority of the world's very richest people. And by the way, that will include, certainly in the richest 10%, everyone, of course, on this part of this meeting. But it's still in global terms, of course, a very small and very wealthy and very privileged elite. So what I take from this is that when we consider, well, who has to do what and how can we pick our strategies for trying to keep this 1.5 degree goal within reach, that we need to think, yes, still about inequality between countries, but also increasingly about inequality within countries as well. And so now my work is mostly focused at the EU level. And so one thing that we take away from the COP is, as Tasneem was saying, that the one thing that just about keeps the 1.5 degree alive, at least on paper, is this idea that countries now are required or requested to come back by the COP this year and show how they have strengthened their emission reduction commitments. And what's, of course, perhaps shouldn't surprise any of us is that a number of countries straight away, as soon as the ink was dry, said, well, that doesn't apply to us. So first Australia came out and said, yeah, well, we're not going to be changing our 2030 target. And even the US came out, even before Kerry was on the plane, and said, well, probably that doesn't apply to us. This is for other people. Now, the real danger here is that all of the rich countries just go around and say, yeah, well, that's not for us. That's for the poor countries. They're the ones that need to increase their targets. And Tasneem will remember this, that it's not the first time that the UNFCCC has been in this kind of situation. Actually, ever since the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009 and the Cancun agreements in 2010, there have been pressure to increase near-term emission reduction targets. There have been processes, there have been analyses done under the UNFCCC, there have been high-level workshops, also all of the same kind of stuff. This has happened before, and yet the fact remains no country changed their 2020 targets. So if we want a different outcome this time around, we are going to have to try and do something a bit different. And there are other reasons why things might be different this time around. all of you that are students studying this stuff know that the world is changing, renewable energy prices are plummeting, the movement is building, lots of reasons to think that things could be different, but also our strategies will need to reflect that. And so partly what we're trying to do is to tell the EU, and the same would go for the UK, for those of you that are based in the UK, that even though the UK has a reasonably ambitious target on the table, as does the EU relative to many other parts of the world, they are going to have to show that they are also considering strengthening their target in time for COP27 and prepared to come back and say what they have done to strengthen their target. Because if the EU and the UK don't do this, you can forget about any other part of the world, frankly, coming up with at least any of the major emitters coming back with stronger targets. And then the 1.5 degree goal really is out of the window, and we can forget all about it. So we'll be putting that pressure on the EU, and that's tough because the EU has this 55% net emission reduction target by 2030. It's only just agreed it in law, in a climate law earlier last year. So essentially, the challenge here for campaigners, for advocates, is tough because you're saying, okay, you guys have just locked that into law. Now you need to change it. So that's very difficult. So what we are arguing, at least, is that in the EU, the way now that we need to get more ambition out of the EU is that they must design the policies that will implement that target with the maximum ambition such that they can overachieve it. And that's what we're working on. There's huge amount of legislation coming through at the EU level, and the same in the UK. And that's, I would say, needs to be a big focus now of all of our efforts, is on that implementing legislation, getting the maximum ambition such that we can overachieve on the targets that are on the table in countries like the UK or regions like the EU. Now, what that requires in itself is a big focus on inequality within our countries as well, because we know that the big barriers to faster acceleration of climate policy, increasingly this is about concerns, whether they're real or perceived, of the negative impacts on poorer parts of our societies. So we need to bring that inequality lens, understand, well, how do we have a just transition within the EU, within the UK, as well as at the global level? And so a lot of our work is focused around that, looking at the ways in which climate policy can be a tool of progressive reform, progressive redistribution within rich countries as well. And I think that's a big part of the agenda that I hope students at the LSE are increasingly focused on. It's about what we do in rich countries as much as it is about what happens in poor countries. And then finally, I'll just offer a couple of reflections on the adaptation side of the story as well. I thought, this is sort of similar really to the loss and damage story that Tasneem was telling about how we have managed in civil society to get loss and damage finally on the agenda, an issue that didn't even exist really 15 years ago. Nobody was talking about it at all. And then, slowly we're getting to this point. With adaptation finance, it's been a similar, long haul. And you only have to really go back to around the year 2000, 2001, when Al Gore was quoted as saying that adaptation was a dirty word. Still lots and lots of the climate movement didn't want to talk about adaptation because they thought that was about admitting failure. The failure that, that we weren't going to reduce emissions fast enough. And it was always a priority, though, of the most vulnerable countries in particular to say, well, we're not causing this problem, and we are most affected by it. And it's happening now. This isn't about the future. So we need funds already to support our adaptation. And it's taken a long, long time to get to a point where that is taken more seriously. And I would say, in the work that I was able to do with many others when I was at Oxfam, we've been part of putting that issue on the agenda. And that has involved, if we think about, well, how has that change happened? Certainly lots of research tracking the finance flows for adaptation, because even once the issue was recognized in the Copenhagen agreements and the Cancun agreements, and there was supposed to be money flowing for adaptation, we started crunching the numbers and were able to show that the overwhelming majority of the money that was flowing was going to mitigation, was prioritizing middle income countries, going to support low carbon emission reduction technologies in those countries where there's some kind of return arguably to be made, and no money was going to the poorest countries and going to adaptation. And so we've been putting a spotlight on that year after year after year with reports, with new stats, media work. The media have always liked that. There's always been good interest from journalists in covering that story about how the money is flowing. We even managed to get some of our campaigners. We ran public campaigns. They always found that very difficult subject to communicate to supporters, Oxfam supporters, NGO supporters about, but we managed to try to find ways to talk about climate finance, whether it was flowing to adaptation or not. These are difficult issues, but through that kind of work and working together with vulnerable countries in the negotiations. And remember here as well, Tasmeen, you'll remember this, it wasn't even that the G77 as a whole never even used to want to talk about adaptation finance. That's a big grouping of all of the developing countries that include, you know, the big middle income countries were quite happy to receive the majority of the money for emission reductions. So this is about also a story of how the least developed countries gradually have increased their influence, their power in those negotiations, how civil society can support them with that, with analysis, with facts, generating pressure through media work from the outside to allow them to get it on the table. And we have seen a quite dramatic increase in the flows to adaptation from an incredibly low baseline in the last 5 or 6 years. And now one of the important outcomes from COP last year was that there was an agreement to double the flows of adaptation finance. Now that's, okay, look, in the grand scheme of things, with the amount of money that we really need for adaptation, it is still essentially a drop in the ocean. But we've got to take some satisfaction from the wins where we get them. And for sure, that was hard fought. And for the negotiators from developing countries that had to go into battle with the United States to get them to commit to doubling adaptation finance, that's no easy task. And so, you know, I just wanted to also kind of put that example on the table, showing how a range of civil society tactics working together with developing country governments at the UNFCCC can lead, albeit over quite a long period, to outcomes which will make a real difference. You know, the doubling of finance for adaptation, if that money is spent well, that makes a difference to communities around the world. So we should celebrate the wins, even if they're relatively small where they come. So that was a couple of reflections, Duncan, and you know, really looking forward to what your colleagues, your students have to say as well.
Thanks, Tim. And thanks again, Tasneem. Right, I believe our first tranche is Leah Trotman, who has no camera but will come on mic, Helga Merkelbach, and then we're going to James Putzel, who is a prof, not a student, but he's got some questions which will come in over YouTube and other channels. So Leah, can you come on mic and ask your question? And then we'll go to both of you. Before you start, Leah, just one thing. Tim, Tasneem, could you just define loss and damage for those of us who are not in the climate bubble? Sorry to be dumb, but it would just help. And interesting that no mention of China or India yet. Let's see if it comes up. But right, over to you, Leah.
Sure. Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Leah Trotman. I'm an MSc Health and International Development student from the Virgin Islands. I study the intersection of climate and health, so I had a question for both of you. Would love your input on this, but in the main outcome document of COP26, the Glasgow Climate Pact, there was kind of no explicit mention of the linkages between global health and climate change. And a lot of health scholars have called this a grotesque oversight. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, because I agree, especially considering the health of all communities, I mean, is arguably what sustains us all. So would love to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Now, Helga.
Okay, thank you. I'm Helga Merkelbach from Germany, and I'm a member of the International Women's League. And my question is the connection between military reduction and maybe financing what we need, the climate justice, the loss and damage. So my question is in particular about what came out on 14th of December. The Nobel Prize winners came out with the idea of a dividend, meaning to cut 2% of expenditure in all countries and put that in a common fund to finance, well, they had several suggestions, but one was climate change. Thank you. I would like to, could that not be the main focus in Egypt? That is my question.
Thanks, Helga. Now, James, you've got quite a few questions, I think, to relay.
Okay, so the first round of the distant questions, and then come back afterwards with some more. So first we have an anonymous question from one of our students. The reduction of fossil fuels is undoubtedly a crucial part of the climate conversation agenda. However, some smaller and undiversified economies echoed the criticism that a large chunk of their population's wages and employment opportunities are dependent on natural resource industries such as oil. Reduction in the name of climate conservation would therefore compromise socioeconomic well-being. Are solutions and alternatives discussed in the wider debate at COP26? Okay. Additionally, the competitive and volatile nature of the global economic market is particularly a reason for the lack of diversification. So surely efforts must begin with the big economy. Is this discussed and stressed? Right. So then secondly, we have questions from a 1983 alumnus from the United States, Kathy Shandling, and her questions are about the US at COP. How was John Kerry's performance at the summit? What did the US as a whole positively contribute to the dialogues that took place at the summit? And what other American attendees contributed the most at the summit?
Great. Is that the lot for the moment, James?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Right. Tasneem, do you want to go first, and then Tim chip in, fill the gaps, or add what your thoughts?
Thanks very much, Duncan, and thanks for the questions. You did ask that I start off, and Tim and I start off by just, maybe it's not simple, but just simply explaining what loss and damage is. So essentially, loss and damage caused by climate change is the point at which we are beyond adaptation. So there are limits to adaptation, and Tim very kindly made this a key issue in his response, this focus on adaptation, which was a long fought for battle as well. Many countries are looking at different ways of adapting to the projected impacts that climate change could have. But loss and damage is the point at which we actually can't do anything about it. And we're already witnessing that. So let me give a simple example. I can't remember which of the small island states it was, but we do know that there are already, due to sea level rise, states or regions or big geographies that will not be able to adapt. It's just going to be impossible to protect themselves, and so essentially results in displacement. And they are also, of course, there's research done about migration, displacement, refugees, now being called climate refugees, due to these impacts that cannot be adapted. You can't create the kind of defensive or alternative methods to protect people. So that's the kind of situation where, you know, you experience loss and damage that is something that cannot be adapted to. There are many examples. There's what is called slow onset, so glacial melting, as I said, sea level rise, ocean acidification. Slow onset, it's not only the extreme weather events that we experience, which is also part of losses and damages. As you can imagine, people lose lives, homes, livelihoods, etc. But there's also the slow onset. It's the kind of, there's economic and non-economic impacts of climate that's considered to be part of a broad family of loss and damage. So, so it really is almost literally the kind of losses and damages that we are experiencing, both in terms of extreme immediate events, but also in terms of the kind of slow onset impacts that we're having to deal with. Happy to try, and if anybody needs information, happy to send through any written information that we have on this to explain it a bit further. So on the issue of health and the fact that the Glasgow Pact did not mention health, even though we were hosting that COP in a pandemic, and one of the biggest health crises ever. Leah, so that is, of course, the problem. I would agree it is a huge criticism. And it's interesting that, in fact, the Paris Agreement has very strong language about health in its preamble. So the fact that, you have it, okay, so it's preambular language, but it is there, it's expressed strongly in the Paris Agreement, and yet that is not drawn through in the subsequent agreements that get reached in these multilateral processes. So it was absolutely, the criticism is correct. The fact that, negotiators sitting there during a pandemic did not think it was going to be important to forefront the issues of the connection between health and the climate crisis is a huge missed opportunity. The issue of military spending, I absolutely support the idea, of course, of making the military, firstly, it's not just about how we can get resources from the military. They're a huge emitter. Military industry is a huge contributor to emissions. So if we can reduce military activity, that would be, we need more and more love in the world. So for sure, a reduction in spending, or this kind of idea of a dividend on military budgets of 2%, I think, of course, we must look at it and look at ways, because we are needing to look at sources of finance now, because rich countries are saying they don't have money. But if we can present alternatives for, and this is another thing, Tim, we've been doing for years, innovative sources of funding, this would certainly be one of them. Other things that have been explored in the past, of course, is what was called the Robin Hood tax. And now, of course, the issue of a wealth tax needs to be looked at very seriously in the light of, as I spoke to the Oxfam report, the whole issue of 10 men obscenely wealthy, while the rest isn't. So wealth tax, and I saw something with that some millionaires already said, yes, please tax us. So that's also another option. So agree with you, Helga, we need to look at this as a serious proposal. And I can already say that maybe what we could do as a network is actually look at this. So thanks for forefronting that issue. On the issue of fossil fuels and, the socio-economic impact, if we're going to move away from fossil fuels, that is a very real problem. I'm from South Africa. We are dependent on coal. We have huge unemployment rates, and even worse so now, and we have high levels of poverty. So the issue of the just transition becomes important again. Right? And here, when we talk about a just transition away from coal in South Africa, for example, that would mean that the process has to be just. So in other words, it has to be an inclusive process that involves all the critical players, workers, the impacted communities, government, business, etc., who work on developing this plan and roadmap towards phasing out coal in the country. But it can only be just if those who are impacted, workers especially, as I said, impacted communities, are at the tables being part of that planning and decision making. And that it would only be just and a just transition if the outcomes of that transition is just as well, especially for those who are most impacted. So certainly it is a challenge. We have to take that challenge head on. And I'm arguing that the best way to do that is through this inclusive and just processes for planning the transition away. And again, as Tim says, and I agree with him fully, this is not just for developing countries or poorer countries, this is for rich countries as well. On the issue of big economies, I know, sorry, I should apologize. We can get into the politics of the COP as well. And Tim touched on it a little bit, but this never ending story of, the big and the powerful versus the majority of those who are poorer and developing is, and the geopolitics around that is a constant feature of multilateral processes, and especially in the UNFCCC. And so the conduct of the US, the conduct of the G7 nations, the UK, the EU, etc., should all come out under China as well should all be looked at, and they all play their roles in differing ways that can be addressed. So, for example, the whole language around the fossil fuel phase down, it turned into quite a big fight. But again, you know, the issues, well, let us come back to a discussion about India in relation to a China, in relation to a US, in relation to, you know, a Europe, etc., and the issue of equity around that. And I'm sure Tim might allude to that. On the issue of, so just to sum up, big economies have to go first. And we recognize the common but differentiated responsibilities issue, but you know, also time is running out. And so those big economies that have the capacity, in addition to the responsibility, to actually go first, should go first. And we often target the G20 for that kind of go first action. On the US, how was Kerry? Well, I didn't meet Kerry. He was around. I must say that one of the big things that was a real bother for us as a network was that we were shut out in the first 2 days of the big leader summit, and everybody was there, but civil society wasn't. And we literally received one ticket or something for a civil society organization, a big network like us, to attend. So I did not meet Kerry, but I do know that Kerry played a very big role in the kind of behind the scenes negotiations, unblocking or blocking things that needed to be moved or blocked. And so the one thing I want to say is that for sure, Kerry played a role in terms of the loss and damage story. The US has never been a progressive player in relation to that issue. That was demonstrated during the period of the Paris Agreement, and that continues today. So we have lots of hard work in relation to the US and to shift them. What other, well, you know, of course, we have lots of colleagues in the civil society movement from the US. They've played an awesome role. In fact, they've played an important role before the COP in trying to put pressure on the US government to, you know, firstly deliver on the things that they should have, to be a good leader at this COP, etc. So that kind of role to push the US government, since they've come back into the process, to provide leadership. Whether, you know, just the fact that they're back was already a good thing, but whether on some of the key issues for climate justice, they conducted themselves well, that we can debate. There was, of course, a very big contingent of, you know, different players from the US. Some of the senators were there, AOC was there, Pelosi was there, Obama was there. So they really came to COP26 in numbers, you know. My simple measure of whether they were good or not, did they contribute or not, and I'm sure they did. But for me, again, did they block loss and damage, yes or no? Yes, they did. And so that is a huge measure of whether the US has actually shifted into being a truly progressive leader on climate change. So I'll leave it there. That was a long answer. I hope I answered the questions, and I'm sure Tim will add and fill in gaps.
Tim, over to you.
Yeah, very, very quick thoughts then on each one. So on health, I think it's true. It must be remarkable that it's not in the UNFCCC language, but I do think that the most important use of health arguments and links is at the national or regional level. You know, it's such a powerful motivator for climate policy, and I think that's one area where we've seen a lot of development in the last decade or decade and a half. You know, much more research, leadership even from the WHO in certain respects. You know, new sort of flagship publications and so on. So. And, you know, and I think that there's still a lot more that civil society can do to make the links between air pollution and climate action and so on, because, you know, I guess if we learn one thing out of the pandemic as well, you know, there's, nothing motivates people to be prepared to change behavior and to demand more of their governments than an immediate risk to the health of you and your loved ones. So I think there's much more scope to do more with the health arguments probably than we're doing as it is. Military spending, yeah, I mean, as Tasneem says, we've tried, I think, every conceivable form of innovative finance raising. So it's not to say, oh, it's a terrible idea. It's obviously an eminently sensible idea. It just goes to show again that the money's there. It's not that one couldn't find the money, right? There's no end of options for us to find the money. Strategically, I'm not sure that that's the one to definitely focus on if you really want to, make a big headway at the COP. One thing that's interesting, actually, as Tasneem said, military is a huge source of emissions. Those emissions are not even accounted for under the UNFCCC in the formal accounting processes of the UNFCCC. So that's all sort of off books form of emissions as well. So there's a huge issue there, but you can't even discuss the military at the UNFCCC. It's like, complete taboo. So you got to pick your fights. I wouldn't personally pick that one, but of course, it just is another example that goes to show, that the money's there. We spend it on all sorts of crazy stuff if we wanted it. I think that the one that's got the most legs at the moment are the kind of wealth taxes, particularly on these obscene gains during the pandemic. But of course, it's a good idea. It's just the one has to pick and choose what might have the best hope, and we haven't got very far with any of the ones that we've proposed until now. On the natural resource thing, yeah, I'd absolutely echo what Tasneem said about, this is just as much an issue in rich countries in terms of finding a way towards a just transition away from reliance on natural resources, but obviously fossil fuels first and foremost, as it is in many other regions. And what we know about it here in the EU is that in the end, it comes down to sharing money. It comes down to a fairer distribution of income and resources in societies. If you, in the end, that's what it's about. If you want to support workers in these industries, you got to find money to do it. And the money at the moment is mostly held in the hands of richer and wealthier industries and people. So it comes back to this kind of the importance of broader social redistribution, broader arguments in favor of social equity that you just can't avoid anymore if you want to deal with climate policy. The big economy's role, I think Tasneem sort of mentioned it. One thing I would say about it, obviously the big economies dominate a lot of the narrative, rightly so, and dominate the geopolitics of climate policy. But one of the things that is important about the UNFCCC, one of the reasons that I guess Tasneem's still finding herself visiting those COPs, and that we still do put quite a lot of effort as civil society into engaging, is because it's the one place where small and vulnerable countries also, in theory at least, have an equal voice. Now, obviously, in realpolitik terms, they don't get anything like the same power. But at certain moments, rich, powerful countries have to sit there and listen to the voices of the most affected communities and their representatives speak truth to power. And it's one of possibly the only multilateral forum in which that actually happens every year. And there's a dynamic there which gives us something to work with, and it's it doesn't achieve change as fast as we would like, but it's something which is quite unique, I think, in international relations. So yes, all good to think about the big economies, but don't forget the role and the power and the influence that the smaller players can have as well. And US, well, I think the thing with the US in the end always escapes the blame, right? The last time I think the US was really singularly blamed as the main kind of narrative coming out of a COP, I think was probably Bali, 2007, when the entire plenary rounded on the US and booed them and said, and that under Bush, the US was seen as the bad guy, and that was reflected in kind of media reporting narratives on the COPs. That never happens anymore. The US got so good since the Obama administration, with the exception of the Trump hiatus. But under the Democratic administrations, the US does a very good job at its comms and its PR in presenting itself. We're back. We're engaging again. They get all sorts of credit for that. But really what has changed, not that much. They're still blocking a loss and damage. They're still, they moved on doubling adaptation finance, which for them was the big give that they had in the COP. But fundamentally, they're one of the biggest, if not the biggest problem, in these talks. And is that reflected adequately in the narratives that you will all have read whether it's in whatever media or whichever, expert that's reflecting. Probably not, so I think that they still get an absolute easy ride, given their enormous power and influence and generally negative role. And then the final, I think that was it. That was all I was going to say for this.
Okay, great. Thanks. Now it's getting interesting. This is excellent. Thank you both for the answers to the questions. I'm going to totally abuse my position as chair because I'm just burning to ask something. And so before we go, I've got a bunch of other questions, but I just need to know, you're both senior strategic thinkers in the climate movement, and you've talked about what other people need to be doing, governments, multilaterals. What is the state of the internal debate within the movement about what you need to do differently? For example, do you need to change or think differently about alliances? Do you need to think or change differently about narratives? Do you need to pull in faith groups? Do you need to change the tactics? Are there limits to the COP process? Is there any alternative to these manufactured moments where we all have our hopes driven up and then driven down again every year now? So what is the stage of thinking within the movement? Sorry, I know I shouldn't do this, but I just had to ask. And now I'll get back into the chair and do it properly. So we have a question from somebody in the student room where there's lots of students listening, so can't come on camera. Thanks for the presentation, Tasneem. You mentioned that we need to learn the tactics using the power that civil society actors have to shift the agendas of policymakers. Could you elaborate more on what does that entail operationally? Second, we have James. James, do you want to, with some YouTube questions? James, do you want to come on mic?
Yeah. Okay. So we had 3 questions in this round from YouTube. One is thank you for the engaging discussion. What do you think was the role of UNCC during COP? Okay. That's from CB. Then the second one is from Dr. Carolina Valiente. Considering the current energy crisis and prices around the world, what would be the core actions to be taken to reduce the importance of traditional energy sources in the short and the medium term? And the third question is from Anthony Valion. What hopes do you have for the roles you see the UK playing this year as still in the chair from Glasgow? And what role do you see Egypt play in 2022-23 when it has the COP chair?
Okay, and finally, sorry, this is a bit of a bumper pack, but I mean, divide them up if you want, or see how you want to play them. Amar Al Hussein, do you want to come on mic and ask, please?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It's great. But one of the things that has been sticking to my mind, and I keep noticing in the newspapers recently, is people who are trying to say, well, we're in a world of high inflation, we're trying to recover from the pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. Is this really the time to go and spend a lot on climate change and transition, which will actually add to these problems? And like the most striking example for me was Biden, who on the Sunday criticized Saudi for not being in the conference to basically participate in COP26, and on Wednesday he criticized them for not increasing their production of oil to aid economic recovery. And also, like, I never thought I'll see the day when I see the FT writing on this subject saying maybe central banks should focus on their real role, which is inflation targeting and stability rather than going through climate change. So I think the pandemic has kind of put a strain on the issue, and if we've learned anything during the pandemic, is the economy is sometimes more important than even the lives of certain percentage of society. So how do you see these two agendas on policymakers' lists competing with each other, and how is this affecting you in the short run and maybe in the long run as well?
Great, some nice easy questions. So let's have Tim. Do you want to go first this time?
Okay, sure. Well, lessons for the movement then on your question, Duncan, what do we need to do differently? I mean, I think we are doing things differently all the time. And I think that the movement is learning all the time. It's growing, it tries out different things. So I think, one thing is to be a bit cautious of sort of, suggesting that we've only been doing one thing and now we need to do something completely different and that will make all the difference. So, I don't think that there's a silver bullet. Obviously, there are certain tactics, certain things that have worked. We're learning, we need to continue to evolve. But I would say that one of the things that has changed a lot over the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years in general with the climate movement is that it has become more holistic in its framing and its narrative and much less of a single issue campaign. And there was a maybe mid 2000s, climate was dominated by environmental groups, certainly in higher income countries. So traditional green groups, framing the issue as essentially a technocratic challenge. It's about putting too many emissions in the atmosphere, and first and foremost, what we have to do is we have to switch the way that we supply energy in our economies from fossil fuels to renewables. I mean, it sounds obvious, right? But that was kind of it, and that nothing else really needed to change, and that we could do all of this through quite a kind of a top-down approach, getting agreements at the UNFCCC level, and nobody need worry too much because sort of a small group of enlightened civil society leaders would fix this all for us at the UNFCCC, and then governments would implement it, and there wouldn't be too many dramatic changes required in our economies. So that was the framing, the dominant framing in many, particularly in high-income countries and in much of the mainstream environmental climate movement. I think that it's completely different now. I really do, and even just have it. That's why I said at the beginning, having Tasneem in the role that she's in is sort of an embodiment of that, because now you find that the mainstream climate movement talks about holistic, transformational. They make links beyond just seeing this as a single issue to trying to think, well, hang on, what does this mean for our economies as a whole? Concepts like just transition open up this much bigger debate about the nature of development, the model of development, what it even means. And what I would say that's what we need to do more of. So I spend a lot of time talking about social justice, and there's no point thinking about climate policy and climate policy and social policy are the same. They're two sides of the same coin. And so we don't want climate just being dealt with in a separate government ministry. We don't want our campaigns built that just talk about climate. It's about building those links to all of the other types of social justice movements, bringing them in under a bigger umbrella and talking about the different kind of economy that we want. And I think that's happening. I do think it's happening. I think that's the way to go. I would say there's still got much further to go. So, there's always, of course, a more, let's say, radical or flank of the movement that wants to talk about challenging growth, challenging using GDP as a metric, and I think that's the direction that the movement will go. And eventually, and the only question really is whether it can build enough power to seek that kind of more transformational change. But there's been this debate always in the movement. There was always initially, I think, a resistance, because it was always seen as hard enough to just switch to renewables from fossil fuels. The more you make this a bigger transformational change, the less likely that is to happen, some people argued. No, we don't want a revolution. We just want to, we haven't got time for, to change everything. We just got to change the energy system. That was the argument. And that won out in the movement for a long time. And I don't think it's won anymore. I think that the argument that actually that doesn't work, we need something bigger and transformational to guide our campaigning, I think that has won in most of the movement. And that's a massive change. Now, what that means, though, is that you've then got to really build power on in order to try and achieve that scale of change. But with things like the pandemic, then of course you perhaps have these windows of opportunity. And the only other thing I'll say, that's all sort of quite a bit big and abstract and so on. So the other thing that I'll point to that I think has made a big difference that should really guide a lot more of our strategic thought in the movement is the impact of elections. I think we've always thought that elections were this kind of route to more substantial change on climate. There was always that hope. And then, we started to organize sort of voting, engagement with voters and vote for your candidate. There was I think we're starting to see that actually happening. If you look at what happened in Germany, with an election, all of a sudden, overnight, you now have a much faster coal phase out in Germany, the biggest coal polluter in the EU, on the table. This is transformational overnight. The same happened in Denmark, same happened in Greece, just happened in Czech Republic even. So at least in Europe, which is where my work is now, I think we're really starting to see how elections really can change the game in a dramatic way very rapidly. And I think that's one of our best hopes, so I think we always thought that political engagement, through elections, that's how, and it doesn't work everywhere. It hasn't worked in Australia, we've lost these climate elections and so on. But I do think that there's increasingly we're seeing, at least in Europe, the power of elections to really dramatically change the prospects for much more substantive policy change. Maybe I'll leave it at that for the other things. I think for Egypt, I think that, as Tasneem was saying, I think the Egypt presidency, this is an African COP. This is going to be about loss and damage. They'll finish the job on that. They will really aim to adaptation finance, putting a lot of those priorities of developing countries squarely on the table will be what I think certainly a lot of the developing countries will be expecting and hoping from Egypt.
Great, thanks, Tim. Over to you, Tasneem.
Okay, so no, thanks, Tim, for teeing up this issue about the movement and what needs to be done still. So absolutely agree that there's been quite dramatic transformation of, now the climate movement isn't homogenous, as you can imagine, and I will talk about the sliver of the movement, which is, that I'm familiar with, which is the network that I'm now heading. And so I have been in this network for quite some time in different capacities. It was a challenge. I want to just say very clear, besides this, which is probably connected, therefore, there's this, sense that climate is a technical issue and we'll do this work in the, all of that kind of framing and thinking about the climate challenge then is very connected to the fact that the civil society movement is pretty northern dominated, for sure, right? In addition to that shifting, not entirely, by the way, I mean, we have large pockets. So this network that I'm heading now is almost a mirror reflection of the wider politics of the world, right? And so we still have those dynamics between our northern dominated members and nodes, our southerners. The perspectives are still different. There is still a sense that, the Europeans will sort out the problem. We just need electric vehicles and we need whatever kind of thing. The sectors need to be intervened in and whatever. Those are not fixes and solutions that would apply to many of those living in the global south, for example. So we still have the kind of difference of perspective where it becomes a challenge is when one is trying to dominate the other. And that still happens. And I can talk a little bit about how just getting to adjusting our tactics is difficult. So it's not an easy transforming the movement to reflect and be more representative and reflect especially the southern perspectives and needs, etc. is not an easy thing. But I do want to add an important, I suppose, development, if we can call it, a really important development. And it was spurred on by the George Floyd murder and then the Black Lives Matter movement. And that is an important recognition that large parts of the climate movement, especially the big greens, if you want to call it that, needed to look at their organizations and needed to interrogate, the kind of white control of especially environmental organizations. And that includes this network, right? And so that is, I think, in this time period, a really important point of transformation. The journey's not over. The interrogation hasn't really been deep enough, but there was a recognition that especially environmental organizations have to look at the issue of representative diversity, inclusion, in their own ranks. So I want to add that to the piece of what needs to change in the movement. And that is something that as a network also we're addressing right now. So this whole, it's because I always think about how language and rhetoric and slogans become sexy over time. But there is this whole move now to looking at decolonializing the way we work, right? I mean, everybody's talking decolonization, et cetera, and that is really important, but it should not be performative. It cannot be just an exercise of, okay, we'll put this in our annual reports, we're decolonizing, and that is that, right? It has to be deep and meaningful decolonialization of the way we work, the practices, our approaches, etc., institutions. So that's one big piece that I need to add to that. Now, let me talk about political strategy. I was always, when I came into the kind of international space after my political, my formal political, well, my activism before that, I was often amazed at exactly this point that, there's just a lack of sophisticated politics, maybe, in terms of strategy and tactics, that we sort of year in and year out, we did almost the same thing for quite some time. And I'm going to say something very tough right now. When I sit and reflect, when especially the youth, you've been in these blah, blah, blah things for over 30 years, what have you done? It is also important for us, especially people like us who have been in the process for many years as well, to reflect on that very seriously. What could we have done differently? What should we have done differently? So I'll say that one of the things that I think we really need to get sharper at is how we use tactics, especially. Now, this network, which is a wide and diverse network, every single member has their priorities. So, an organization would say, well, we think nature has to be the priority, and we need this network to go on nature. I'm just using that as nature is an important priority. So this issue-based approach that Tim refers to, while we've moved away from the kind of silos of, social versus climate, or, race versus climate, or whatever, this silo approach is still a big problem for NGOs. I want to be very frank about it. And the kind of brand protection is still something serious in the climate movement, in NGOs. Well, not only in the climate movement. So that needs to be, once we can get organizations, big NGOs to understand that we're in this fight together, we're going to have to put in a coherent and cohesive and unified effort, and that not everybody's pet issue is going to necessarily be dealt with all the time, because that just disperses power, and that we use power more wisely and tactically. That is something I think we need to get better at as a movement. So I'm speaking very frankly, Duncan. I don't think we achieved any big changes around getting better and smarter at strategy and tactics. We do test things, but we've not enough of that ability. And I think we can do better at it. So I want to just be very frank about that. I think that the one question here was our hopes for the UK role. Let me be polite. I'll try.
No, don't be.
I just would love to have a UK presidency that doesn't speak with two faces of some kind, all the kind of great performative, curated communications and narrative that they put out as a COP presidency, and then what they do as a government. I mean, many governments do that, but really when you're a COP president, you can't, speak with one voice in a COP environment and tell other governments what to do, and especially poorer countries, and then you busy supporting an oil field or whatever else they're doing in the UK, right? You just cut your aid budget and no, we don't have money, we're not going to deliver, or we're doing everything already. That kind of COP presidency just entrenches the lack of trust and the lack of credibility, and we really have a trust and credibility deficit. So I'd like a UK government to be humble, be honest about the challenges, and not try and present it in some kind of nice spin which they really did at this Glasgow COP. So that's what I'll say on them. On the role of Egypt, as I said before, and as Tim also reiterated, of course, there's challenges in Egypt, right? I mean, they're political challenges. We're going into a tough environment. But one of the things that I think we really have to keep in mind is, Egypt is on the African continent. And even if it means we have to push that understanding with an Egyptian presidency, then we have. I mean, they do play a really important role in the Africa group generally. They played a leadership role. They, especially led on the finance in the Africa group, etc. But I do think we must constantly be clear that this is an African COP, because coming back to Africa at this point is really important. And it is an important moment for us to then say, well, this is the place where we look at the needs of the vulnerable, right? It was not going to happen through a UK presidency, but hopefully we can convince an Egyptian presidency to make the African agenda and vulnerable people's agenda the key agenda. And I've already seen that they've put out their kind of framing for the COP, and resilience is there. We mustn't hide loss and damage behind resilience. So we'll work on that as well. On the issue of this whole thing now, the pushback, this is the pushback on climate change is too costly, and then using the pandemic as the excuse and etc. This is the constant, this is where tactics from the opposition is really, really sharp. So, I've been reading that the big, fossil fuel players, the old players that would fund climate denialism, etc., are getting a bit sophisticated. So what they do is you capture the rhetoric, you make this big noises about, yeah, we committed to net zero. Everybody can be committed to net zero by 2050, and do absolutely nothing about it. And so now I believe it's called climate delayism. So people have moved from climate denialism to climate delayism. And this whole part of building up that narrative, now is not the time, it's too costly, what's happening with our economies, inflation, etc., is all part of those tactics of, it was crude through the denialism. It's just going to get more and more sophisticated as, it becomes clearer and clearer to the world's population that we can't ignore the crisis and it must be dealt with. So yeah, it's tough. We have to just, all of us, and especially LSE students you should be actually challenging these perspectives. Write into the newspapers, put out blogs, put out tweets, challenge this, you the economists. So certainly I think that must be challenged. It's part of the tactics and the strategy of the opposition and those who would just want to keep the status quo for as long as they want. There was one last question too, about the energy crisis. Yeah. Actually, no, it's going to be too difficult for me to talk about what are the short-term actions there. But certainly, the International Energy Agency has come out with very sound and solid and surprising reports last year about what is needed, especially in this decade, to keep us on track and aligned with 1.5, and put in place all those proposals, very practical and clear proposals, some of which we agree with and some of which we can still debate, but certainly they've put out what should be done in the short term. And one of the clear messages out of that report was, in 2021 already, there should be no new investments in fossil fuels, which of course nobody's taking seriously, especially those who are continuing to invest in fossil fuels. So I would suggest that, go back and read the International Energy Agency's report that they put out last year on 1.5 and achieving net zero. That does help talk to what are those things that, you know, and it's all the usual things that we're talking about, really massively scaling up investment in renewables, rolling out the implementation, etc. But certainly I would refer the questioner to that report. And then I wasn't clear about what the question was about the UNF, what UNF, it was UNFCCC, I'm assuming the question. What was the role of the UNFCCC, James? Maybe missed it. Yeah, okay. Well, you know, the UNFCCC is really there as the facilitator of the process, right? And so they, the secretary provides also, should and will provide as needed, you know, political leadership in some ways, and would try and give that kind of articulation of what the ambition levels, etc., would be. But we must understand that the UNFCCC Secretariat and the UNFCCC per se, the structure of that Secretariat, cannot direct and move and decide what should and should not happen, because they need to be independent. The UNFCCC is a party-driven process. They love to remind us as civil society, of course, the parties themselves, that this is a party-driven, in other words, a country-driven process. And so it's very difficult for the UNFCCC Secretariat to play any kind of directional role. So in Glasgow, I think the UNFCCC Secretariat had their hands full, and I'll say this quite frankly about it, because the UK government had made, if you remember, the way they sort of characterized, this is going to be the most inclusive COP ever, and the most people are going to, you know, it's going to be many, many people in a pandemic, by the way. And so, you know, lots of organizations were registered for the first time, and the UNFCCC had their hands full because there wasn't really an honest communication with all these many little organizations who ended up in Glasgow, that they would not be able to really participate in the UNFCCC process, for example. So those who have come there for the first time, big expectations, they're going to the Leaders Summit, they're going to be able to sit there and get tickets, or they're going to be able to speak on the floor of the UNFCCC. All of them came with that expectation. And that was largely an expectation set up by the UK government. So the poor UNFCCC, who has to manage all of these things and, you know, deal with the logistics of interventions, etc., massive pressure on them to, and demands and expectations to be able to participate, and they couldn't. So I do think the role of presidencies play an important role in terms of how a UNFCCC Secretariat can also, you know, be well functioning during processes like that. I think I've covered all the questions.
I'm amazed by your stamina, the pair of you. We have, I'm afraid, a pile of questions, and we're running out of time. So what we're going to do now is a kind of random throwing of questions at the wall. And get all the last questions in, and then Tasneem, you can entirely choose which ones you wish to answer, because otherwise we want to give everybody a chance to ask their question, but we've now sort of flipped to the beauty parade section. So James, you have a question from the room, this mythical room where all the students are sitting, and you have 2 YouTube questions. We then have David Lewis and Hafsa, and I'm not sure, Hafsa Ahmed. I'm not sure if there's anybody else, James.
And then there are a couple more YouTube questions.
Oh my God. Okay. So James, just take it away and ask loads of questions from YouTube. We've never had YouTube so active. I don't know what's happened tonight. And then we'll go to David and Hafsa.
So first, our student in the viewing room, Lexus Bacon, says, panelists have emphasized the importance of eliminating the fossil fuel industry, but didn't explicitly state what you're advocating as an alternative. The most mainstream transition away from fossil fuels right now are electrification and renewables. While these technologies do reduce carbon footprint, they too have many detrimental impacts on historically marginalized communities, both in the beginning, critical minerals mining, and the end, the e-waste recycling of their life cycle. How can we make an equitable climate transition if the solutions are just creating more instances of injustice? I think it's a really good question. Then we have A question from AJ Sunglao from YouTube. A common struggle regarding climate change is the lack of research focused on the impact on LMICs, I think low and middle income countries, that is, done by lower and middle income country researchers. Are there discussions on increasing funding to LMIC research? Another question from Michelle Menzing from YouTube. I would be interested in Tasneem's perspective on the securitization of the debate around climate justice. Pelosi defended increasing the Pentagon budget because of future security threats. What about connections to the peace movements? Are there any discussions ongoing? Then let me do the other YouTube ones, and then we'll finish with David coming on screen. There's one from Anthony Valion from YouTube. The Republicans may regain Congress in 12 months, and Trump may be back in 2024. What future proofing can climate campaigners do to get some lock-in, some gains from Biden's presidency this year? And then Marie Pullman from YouTube. Tim has mentioned that there is large inequality in individual carbon responsibility. To what extent is this driven by the impact of investment behavior? That was a question I had. Does mitigating climate change also require reforming the international financial system, which we failed so badly to do in the 2008 aftermath? And then maybe you turn to David.
So David Lewis, and then Hafsa Ahmed, and then, oh, sorry.
Thank you. I feel bad adding to such a long list of already interesting, complicated questions, but I would love to get your views on my question, which is to ask you what you think we should be doing in universities more, whether it's research, teaching, collaboration, public engagement. And I'm speaking about universities in both North and South, and actually you touched on it briefly, and in relation to students, and actually one of the questions just now also touched on it in terms of low-income country research. But I think there's been a lot of criticism about universities not really doing enough, and I'd love to just have your brief thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Hafsa?
Hi, thank you so much for that presentation. I'm not sure if we'll have time for this, but I'm curious to know about any sort of emergent narratives this name from South Africa about the on the intersection of climate justice and the right to the city. So specifically when we think about informal settlements and the urban poor. I asked this question to contextualize it, because in Pakistan there has been a rising debate among informal settlements and dwellers of what we call squatter settlements or slums or what have you, where they are sort of combining their mobilization for greater equality and right to the city with climate justice and forming that sort of narrative. So I'm curious to know what grassroots mobilizations might look like in other global South contexts like that of South Africa.
Okay, and we're going to cut Tim out of this because of time. So Tasneem, over to you.
Okay, well, let me try and be very quick, and I'm not going to address all of the questions, so hopefully Tim will be able to pick up some of it. So very quickly, on the issue of, the problematizing the issue of alternatives and, dealing with this assumption that, and the kind of narrative that we have that, oh, these alternatives are all great, then there are no problems, especially renewable energy. Absolutely have to take that issue on, especially now we know what lithium mining is doing to indigenous communities and all of these things. It's not just the kind of mining related impacts, but it's also exclusions of communities, etc., that we have to look at. The focus is pretty much, when we talk solutions, the private sector, big projects, that's how we're going to do it. And yes, of course, there's going to have to be a massive scale up and that, but there's also alternative ways of rolling out these alternative renewable energy options. And so exploring, and there are cases already, community ownership, for example, of electricity generation systems through renewable energy. And if you have that kind of localized approach, you probably would, in a way, deal with any potential injustices that emerge, whether that's how you deal with labor rights or gender rights, etc., if it does get localized. But also what I think, in addition, we need to do is ensure that in the identification of solutions just generally and in these global processes, we have to address head on the issue of all of these other injustices that we are witnessing as well, and therefore have those who are impacted already at the tables, listening to what would be needed and presenting alternative ways for how we could address, both our need to scale up and roll out alternative energy sources, but also ensuring that it never is an option, that it would never be an option to also then result in any injustice. So that is a big challenge, not a simple issue to resolve right now.
Tasneem, could you
yeah.
just choose one or two more, because you've got about 5 minutes?
Yes.
Sorry,
Okay.
we're going to have
I
to
do
just leave
want to
people gagging for
universities.
more.
Can I deal with the universities issue?
Go for it.
Yeah. So look, universities have a really important role. More and more, the academics, the scientists, etc., are starting to step out more bravely and courageously. Scientists used to say, no, we're independent and we can't talk about these issues, and this is political. But the courage and needing academics, and especially scientists and social scientists and students, all of you, to just be audacious right now. Now's not the time to hide behind, academic protocols or diplomacy or whatever. Now's the time to be talking truth to power. We're talking about people's lives on the line and all this unbelievable immoral injustice in the world. So I would argue, become audacious, get much more actively involved in all of the things happening in the national and local space, and just have voice and have courage and be bold. So I'm going to leave it there, Duncan. That's
what a great place to leave it. That's fantastic. Well, I think we've had just the most extraordinary event here, and we've had the passion and the knowledge combined. Really acute analysis of the situation, of the challenges, of the politics, both internal and external. It's been absolutely brilliant. So huge thanks to Tasneem Essop and Tim Gore, both really, really fantastic presentations. And above all, to everybody who asked questions, because the Q&A is always the best bit of these conversations. And this week was particularly good. So I think we started off the term really well. As I said right at the beginning, next week we have Irungu Houghton talking about being an activist on human rights in Africa. So in some ways it follows from what you were saying about the Egypt COP. So I'm really happy about the way this term is shaping up. Thank you both. Thank you everyone who stayed with it. I know it's Friday afternoon. Thank you to all the students in the student room. And do come back next week. I hope it'll be, even if it's even as half as good as this, it'll be worth coming for. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.